Today is the fourth Sunday of Advent, also known as Rorate Sunday. The epistle reading is taken from St. Paul's epistle to the Corinthians. Brethren, let a man so account of us as the ministers of Christ, and the dispensers of the mystery of God. Here now it is required among the dispensers that one be found faithful. But to me it is a very small thing to be judged by you or by any man. But neither then do I judge my own self. For I am not conscious to myself of anything, yet I am not thereby justified. For he that judgeth me is the Lord. Therefore judge not before the time until the Lord come. He will both bring to light the hidden things of darkness, and will make manifest the counsels of the hearts. And then shall every man have praise from God. Please stand for the gospel. The gospel reading is taken from the Holy Gospel according to St. Luke. In the 15th year of the reign of the Emperor Tiberius, Pontius Pilate was governor of Judea, Herod was prince in Galilee, his brother Philip in Iturea and in the region of Trachonitis, and Licinius in Abilene, during the high priesthood of Annas and Caiaphas. The word of the Lord came upon John, the son of Zachary, in the desert. And he went all over the country around the Jordan, announcing a baptism whereby men repented to have their sins forgiven, even as it is written in the book of the sayings of the prophet Isaiah. Behold, the voice of one crying in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord, straighten out his paths. Every valley shall be exalted, and every mountain and hill made low. And the crooked shall be made straight, and the rough places made plain. And all mankind shall see the saving power of God. This is the gospel of our Lord Jesus Christ. Last week, in the Chronicle, in the letters to the editor, someone wrote a letter, again, of course, criticizing the church, but in the course of that criticism, they wrote that the church has always upheld the notion of the absolute primacy of the individual conscience. And of course, that is interpreted to mean that you must follow your conscience in all cases. We were all misinformed by Jiminy Cricket in Walt Disney's Pinocchio from 1940. That you should always, and under all circumstances, let your conscience be your guide. So I want to clear up the church's official and traditional teaching on the matter of following one's conscience. First of all, conscience is not a separate and distinct faculty or power of man. There are two proper powers of the soul, the intellect and the will. Conscience is an action, an operation, or a function of the intellect. Now, the acts proper to the intellect are conception, or the getting, if it will, of ideas, judgment, which is perceiving the relationship between ideas, and reasoning, which involves grasping the relationship between judgments. Now, the action of conscience is the action of making a judgment. But it is an action of the intellect in making a judgment of a very specific and particular kind. Conscience is a judgment about the moral value, that is to say, the rightness or wrongness of a proposed course of action. In fact, the judgment of conscience is the final practical moral judgment. The final practical moral judgment about an action actually proposed to be done here and now. Now, since conscience is the final practical judgment about the morality of a presently proposed action, conscience then, or the judgment of conscience, is the conclusion of a prior intellectual process of reflection and evaluation. And this prior intellectual process is called deliberation. Now, deliberation is an evaluative process in which the proposed action itself, in terms of the kind of action, the nature of the action itself, together with the existential, concrete circumstances surrounding and affecting the action, all this data is measured against the norm of the moral law. That is, of course, the natural moral law, as well as for us, the revealed moral law, which is given to us in the Scriptures and in the magisterium of the Roman Catholic Church. Now, the purpose of this deliberative process that precedes the judgment of conscience is to determine whether the concrete proposed action is or is not in conformity with the moral law. And the conclusion of this process, as I say, is the judgment of conscience itself. And that judgment is expressed in this way: I should here and now perform this action, or I should not here and now perform this action. And of course, the ultimate basis for the judgment of conscience is the preamble principle of the moral law, bonum faciendum est, mala vitandum est. The good should be done, evil should be avoided. That stands as the first premise in all ethical and moral deliberation. Now, conscience then is a judgment. It's the action of making a judgment. And as often is the case with most judgments, the judgment of conscience can be either true and correct, or false and erroneous. And it can be either certain, in the sense that one is sure of one's judgment, or it can be doubtful, in the sense that one is unsure of one's judgment. Now, look at the matter of truth first. Whenever we talk about logical truth in the matter of judgment, it's generally defined as adequatio rei et intellectus, which means simply the conformity of the judgment with the extramental reality. Now, the judgment of conscience is true and correct when it is in conformity with right reason. That is to say, reason rightly discerning the objective moral order that exists independently of the mind. Now, the rule regarding a right and correct conscience is very simple. A right and correct and true conscience always binds absolutely and essentially. St. Thomas uses the phrase simpliciter et per se. But we can make mistakes in the judgment of conscience. So what about an erroneous conscience? Are we obliged to follow, or may we follow, an erroneous conscience? Now here we have to make a very important distinction. An erroneous judgment in conscience can be either voluntary or involuntary. And if it's voluntary, it can be either directly voluntary or indirectly voluntary. So we have to address all those possibilities. Looking first then at a voluntary error in making the judgment of conscience. First of all, there is a directly voluntary error. And this is due to vincible ignorance under the aspect of affected ignorance. one knows that one is going against the law, and one chooses to go against the law. One often deliberately reinterprets one's situation in such a way as to exempt one from the law. There is this mental manipulation of the circumstances. There is a rationalization of the situation, and the conclusion of that mental manipulation and rationalization is to exempt one from the law. For example, someone who wants to have an abortion and knows it's wrong. Well, they bring up such things as, my God, it would be terrible to bring a child into the world in the state of things as they are. We don't have enough money to support a child. The child couldn't possibly have the education or the advantages that it ought to have. And they work this around to the point where an abortion seems virtually to be a moral obligation on their part. That, of course, is directly voluntary ignorance, or directly voluntary error. Now, regarding a conscience that is erroneous by way of directly voluntary error, the rule is one may never act in accord with the directly voluntary erroneous conscience. Never. What about an indirectly voluntary error in the judgment of conscience? Now, when we talk about an indirectly voluntary error in the judgment of conscience, this is due to, again, vincible ignorance taken as ignorance by reason of culpable neglect, laziness, sloth, or disinterest. For example, one has very good reason to believe that one is in error. One knows that the error is correctable, but one neglects or is too lazy to take the means to correct the error. Regarding an indirectly voluntary error in conscience, the rule is, again, one may never act in accord with an indirectly voluntary erroneous conscience. But what about involuntary error? Involuntary error in the judgment of conscience arises from a state of invincible ignorance. Now, what is invincible ignorance? Invincible ignorance is ignorance that for the time being at least cannot be overcome because the requisite knowledge cannot be reasonably and practicably acquired. So when an error in the judgment of conscience is due to invincible ignorance, one is not at fault that his judgment of conscience is erroneous. And one has no reason for believing that he might be mistaken or in error with regard to his judgment. So the rule then regarding a directly voluntary erroneous conscience, we're talking about now a rule regarding a conscience arising from invincible ignorance. And this, of course, would be an involuntary error. The rule is this: an invincibly erroneous conscience does bind, but accidentally and relatively. St. Thomas uses the phrase secundum quid et per accidens. In other words, it binds only on the condition that the ignorance is in fact presently not correctable, and it binds only for as long as the invincible ignorance persists. And of course, as soon as one recognizes that one is ignorant and realizes that there are means to correct that ignorance, then it moves into the area of directly voluntary error. And of course, the rule there is that one may not act in accordance with a directly voluntary erroneous conscience. There's just one final issue, and that is the issue of a doubtful conscience. May one act in accordance with a doubtful conscience? And the answer here is the point is to remember that doubt here is an entirely different situation from an erroneous conscience. Doubt refers to a situation in which one is perplexed and is simply not able to make a decision about the rightness or wrongness of a proposed course of action. So in fact, one who is in a state of doubt has not made a judgment of conscience, is unable to make a judgment of conscience, is unable to come to that conclusion about the morality of a proposed course of action. And the rule regarding a conscience, or a doubtful conscience, I should say, is that one should not act in the state of a doubtful conscience if it is at all possible to resolve the doubt. However, in situations in which it is simply impossible to get enough information to form a correct, true, and certain conscience, where it's impossible to do this before you have to advance to action in an omnia parata, everything is prepared situation, then one is simply not morally responsible for the action performed, because one is equivalently then in a state of invincible ignorance. So the rule then is not always let your conscience be your guide, or act always in accordance with the judgment of your conscience. The rule is you are obliged to act in accordance with a true and correct conscience. But in the case of a directly voluntary erroneous conscience, or an indirectly voluntary erroneous conscience, you are obliged not to act in accordance with that conscience. And in the case where you are unable to come to some judgment of conscience, you're unable to come to a conclusion in this deliberative process, if in fact you have to act in that state of perplexity, you're not held morally responsible for the action that you perform. So Jiminy Cricket was wrong, quite wrong, when he said, always let your conscience be your guide. And those in the church today who say, simply act in accordance with your conscience, they're quite wrong too. Because we have an obligation to form our conscience. We have an obligation to take the means to come to a true and correct conscience. And of course, we have the sources of morality, the natural moral law, and of course, the revealed law of Almighty God, as expressed, as I said, in the sacred scriptures and in the moral magisterium of the church. You can hardly call yourself a Roman Catholic if you have the audacity to set yourself above the moral magisterium and declare yourself exempt from the laws that Holy Mother Church proposes. Credo in unum Deum, Pater omnipotens, Pater Filius et Spiritus Dominus vobiscum, oremus. Ave Maria, gratia plena, Dominus tecum, benedicta tu mulieribus, et benedictus fructus ventris tui. Various to be done in regards to the sacrifice from the becomes commensurate with inconspected being and Padre fratres ut me quam Christum sacrificium acceptabile fieramus Deum Patrem omnipotentem.
Suscipiat Dominus sacrificium de manibus tuis, ad laudem et gloriam nominis tui, ad utilitatem pauper nostrum totiusque ecclesiae tuis.
Amen. Sacrificium Sanctus Christus Sanctus. Volete votium, dice Domino nostrum